I thought of a new subtitle for this talk, which would be From Khalq to Khuluq to Tahalluq. And if you hear the presentation, hopefully you will understand, or maybe I should just translate what I mean by that triad. Khalq, the creation, right? Cosmology. Khuluq, the great character, the cultivation of virtues. And tahalluq is from the thought of Ibn Arabi, which involves the human being being able to take on the divine qualities. And that is the basis of my talk today, inshallah. I'm going to briefly, in the limitations of time, speak a little bit about classical theory of the Asma al-Husna. And of course, this subject is an ocean, right? So today we just have maybe a small vessel from the ocean, hopefully more than a drop, but certainly not the whole ocean. And then I'm going to move to something that is, I think, very new to you. I'm going to talk about Western Sufi, Americans, Britishers, how they are employing the Asma al-Husna as a spiritual practice. So the Asma al-Husna, and inshallah, they'll be able to make this a little bigger, but I think you will be okay. Apologies to those in the back. But don't worry, I don't really read that much from the slides. Usually I just use them to jog my memory while I'm talking, because I like to have a visual cue. So as this audience knows very well, the divine names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are derived from the Quran and also the hadith. And in particular, there's more than one, but there's a hadith from at-Tirmidhi, which lists 99 names. But of course, lists of the divine names can go beyond that. They can vary a little bit. So there are revealed Naqli sources for the idea of the divine names. Now, commenting on the divine names was very popular in the Islamic tradition, and there are more than 150 books that are written classically about the Asma al-Husna. Those who have studied more specifically, in detail than I, the whole history of these divine name commentaries, say they kind of go through, they're in three main genres, and those genres develop historically. Number one, philological, the linguistic study of the names. For example, Ar-Rahim, how is that related to the root Rahama, and so on? That would be a philological approach. Which names come together? That's philological. Everybody gets that? Theological would be like the debates between the Mu'tazila and the Ashariya. What is the relation of the names to the Zat? Right? Are they separate? How close they are? That would be a theological discussion. Our topic today, since we are in a Sufi conference, is the Sufi or the mystical commentaries on the divine names. So in classical Sufism, some of you may be familiar with this. There is, for example, Al-Qushayri has the Shar al-Asma Allah al-Husna, and he explains the 99 names. There's a preface, and then he takes the names one at a time. But this is what we might call discussing. He discusses, spiritual lessons that are derived from the name. So it's in the genre of the virtues. Human beings learn the names, and they can cultivate some of the virtues, that's the khuluq, based on the names. Also, Al-Ghazali. So this is a page from a translation of Al-Ghazali, the 99 beautiful names. speaking of Al-Ghazali's approach. And Al-Ghazali also takes an ethical approach to the names. It is relevant for human beings to know the names of Allah. At the same time, there needs to be a firm distinction between the divine being and the human, right? That is the classical Asherite theological position. And that is, the meanings of the names are ethically relevant, but still human beings, while they are not the same. I'm sure you've heard this discussion, right? Allah is Rahim. We human beings can aspire to be compassionate, but Allah is the all merciful, but we human beings can have some trace of that mercy. That would be the approach of those Sufi commentators in the theological Asherite virtue tradition. Now we're going to note a shift from virtue to being, and I bet you can guess when that happened, with Ibn Arabi and his school, the Akbari school. So Ibn Arabi and his school would assert that only Allah is real. Everything that other than Allah is derivative, is a reflection, is a tajalli. So you see there's a shift there, right? From the separation to a kind of unity, which some scholars have called an ontological, I know that's the big word, ontological being, wujud. So the Akbari school is more about wujud and the names as a guide to wujud. But we also see another trajectory in Sufi appropriation of the divine names with a close contemporary of Ibn al-Arabi, Tilimsani. And with Tilimsani, you see emerging the use of the divine names in a way that we may call, and by the way, I think you get it, this is, what would you say, academic history of thought lecture, and maybe some sociology as well. But I think you can feel a trace of the Sufi mysticism, the Sufi hall, if you will, behind it. So back to At-Tilimsani, he and his followers start to use the names in what we would call academically a magical way. Reciting the names can do something in the world. I'm reminded of the remarks of Sultan Sahib this morning, where he was giving that example of somebody getting a murshid, right? Somebody getting a murshid to cure their animals or breathe on some salt or do something like that. And rather, Sultan Sahib said, you might recite some divine names like Ya Latif, or, that would be what scholars would call a kind of magical healing use as the names, which can also be for psychological healing of the ailments of the soul. So more and more, even Al-Kushairi in the Rasala speaks of the murshid assigning the recitation of names to a disciple. So the idea of reciting the names as a spiritual and healing practice, it's not totally new. I mean, it's there before Tilimsani, but that more, if you will, what we call thaumaturgic or magical use is somewhat later. Now we quickly come to Ibn Arabi and the divine names, because he is the one who really elaborates on their use in a understanding in a cosmological way in the Al-Futuhat al-Makkiyah, but also in a small treatise, which is now translated into English, Insha al-Dawa'ir, the creation of circles. And there Ibn Arabi has almost a mythology of the divine names being, shall we say, at the highest state in the realm of non-being. And the names want to come into existence with the tajalliyat. So one of the names, the generous, almost implores that the door be open for all of the divine names to come into the universe. So remember, wujud, everything is a reflection of the real through the Asma al-Husna. And of course, the Akbarian school is a huge influence on Sufi thought, including the Sufi poets that we are speaking of today. But you have different trajectories. You have the South Asian school of Akbarian Sufi interpreters, as well as a strong Ottoman influence. So I'm sorry you can't see this bigger, but the point that I'm showing this diagram, you have a circle of the signs of the zodiac, you have a circle of the planets, you have a circle of the letters of the Arabic alphabet, you have a circle of the different mansions of the moon, and then you have different Asma al-Husna. So it is a kind of understanding of the cosmos as having these, if you will, distinct parts, energies. And remember, later Sufism becomes more and more humanistic. So we could say even with Rumi, I mean, on the one hand, Ibn Arabi is explaining the process of descent, of the breath of the merciful, of the tajalliyat into the cosmos. But Rumi is speaking of the reed flute. So the human being is, the divine breath is breathing through we human beings. And that is our path of return to Allah through experience in this world. So you have this humanistic phase of ascent, and the divine names are going to be clues along the way. Because in Ibn Arabi's thought, each one of us is a unique combination of the Asma al-Husna. So he who knows his Lord knows himself, or she who knows her Lord knows herself. And by contemplating and perhaps even doing practices, reciting the divine names, one sees within. And this is part of the practice of ascent. So dhikr, the remembrance of Allah, also can include recitation of the divine names to ascend and return to the source. And of course, in later Sufism, names become associated with various lata'if, with, there's a whole mapping of the names onto the body. Now we are going to shift. That was an introduction to classical Sufis and the divine names. Now I'm going to talk about contemporary Western Sufi practices that are derived from Ibn Arabi's understanding of the divine names. I'm going to use ideas from Islamic studies, religious studies, and I'm also going to introduce you to some Western Sufi movements. And part of my, what we call a toolbox, part of my way of thinking about these things also involves concepts from sociology, such as new religious movements, religion and modernity, psychology, depth psychology, Freud, Jung, Kohut, a third wave humanistic psychology, and body work. So we will come to understand why the divine names are appealing to practitioners of Sufism, I'm putting that in scare quotes, who are living in the West. Some of the key concepts of Ibn Arabi. This is part of classical Sufi thought, but you will see that it appeals to modern people. Ibn Arabi, I was a hidden treasure and I wanted to be known. Kuntu kanzlun makhfiyun wa aridtu an u'raf. So I was a hidden treasure and I wanted to be known. The divine being, Allah, knows God's self through our human experience. That's a little bit like Rumi and the flute, right? Our human experience is very important. Can you see how that appeals to modern people, even those living in the West? Also, tahalluq, human beings, this is Ibn Arabi, tahalluq, human beings are able to cultivate the divine qualities in themselves. Now, it's interesting the relationship between universities and academic scholars of Ibn Arabi and people who are practicing spiritual cultivation. So they are reading the works of the scholars. So one of the earliest scholars who published on Ibn Arabi in English was Afifi, an Egyptian scholar who wrote about Ibn Arabi. And later then, so I think Afifi, sorry, I didn't look it up when he published like 50s, 60s. But then the works of Henry Corbin. So there was a French scholar called Henry Corbin. Anyone ever hear of Henry Corbin? Okay, he was a French scholar, and he looked at ancient Iran. For example, ancient Iran, he was very fascinated by Iran, Shiism, Sheikhism, different currents of esoteric thought, but also he was interested in Ibn Arabi. So he has a book, Creative Imagination, in the works of Ibn Arabi, where he talks about many things, but one that might interest you, and it's related to the topic, is the idea of himma. Himma. So the Akbarian himma is being able to concentrate your thought. That's the creative imagination, sort of like takhayul, but not takhayul like imagination, but like almost like bringing things into being connected to the alam al-mathal, right? So it's Sufi cosmology. There's a reality above our reality. We human beings, by spiritual practice and by concentration, can almost be involved in the process of creation, right? Now, I think you can see why that would also appeal to modern Westerners. And there are many other interpreters of Ibn Arabi in the West, British, French, American, Spanish. Europeans are very fascinated by Ibn Arabi. And I have to say, there is now an explosion of scholarships and translations of Ibn Arabi that did not exist before. But Sufism in the West comes in different flavors. In an early paper, which you can access on academia.edu under my name, I wrote a paper called The Garden of Western Sufi Movements, and it was a kind of metaphor. So in that garden, there are perennials, hybrids, and transplants. Today, we're not going to talk about the transplants. Those are mainly immigrant Sufis to the West who keep on practicing like they do in Pakistan or Egypt. But the perennials are people like René Guénon, Fritjof Schuon, Syed Hussein Nasser, that there's one perennial truth, and all religions and all mysticisms is a manifestation of the perennial truth. But often, it varies, but often the perennials are universalists. Sufism is universal. It existed before Islam, and maybe it's Sharia light or maybe no Sharia at all, right? Sufism is like a mysticism. Hybrids begin to emerge mainly in like the 1980s. And those are when Sufi teachers come to America or Europe from Turkey, from India, from Pakistan, and they attract both co-ethnics and they attract some Westerners. So those are two groups. I'm going to talk about them quickly, being mindful of the time. So first, we're going to talk about some perennial Sufis and how they use the divine names. So one of the theories of religion in America is Americans like their religion to be therapeutic. What does that mean? They want religion to do something for you, heal you if you're sick, make you get rich if you're poor. Like that's therapeutic, right? Doing something. So the universal Sufis, the perennial Sufis, they will want to practice Sufism in a way that they are getting healthier, that they are having deeper psychological knowledge that's therapeutic. Often they do not talk so much about Islam, maybe not at all, but they'll talk about Sufi psychology or Sufi healing. Perennialists and universalists are more about private spirituality. They may not go to the masjid. In fact, I would say demographically, they're unlikely to be involved with the Muslim communities. So there are a lot of different ones. I'll say a little bit about the Inayatiyya. I won't say as much about traditionalist Sufis. If you like, I can ask in the question period. Well, hopefully this is a little bigger. I don't know has anyone ever heard of Sufi Inayat Khan? Sufi Inayat Khan. You guys never heard of Sufi Inayat Khan? Oh, somebody heard. I'm actually asking not just to test your knowledge. I want to know, like, should I explain? Okay. So I'm getting a sense I should explain a little bit. So Sufi Inayat Khan was from Baroda, now known as Vadodara, in India. And he was a musician, Muslim musician, a very top musician. I think he played the veena. But anyway, he had a Chishti Murshid in Hyderabad, and that Murshid instructed him to go to the West. So in 1910, he came to America and he lived in Europe, and he attracted many disciples. And so Inayat Khan, his sons, so Inayat Khan passed away at unusually, he in one of the flu epidemics. He went to India and he tragically passed away in 1927. But then his brothers and sons continued this teaching. So this is one of the most well-known forms of Sufism in the West, various lineages. Now, the one that I think is going to be the most fascinating for you is one called the Ruhaniyat branch of this Sufi order. And this is a book here, and you might get interested in this book. It's called A Sufi View of the 99 Names of God, Physicians of the Heart. And it is written by Western Sufi teachers and psychologists and scholars of Arabic who are involved in this branch of the Inayatiyya that there was an American guy, Samuel Lewis, who became a disciple of Inayat Khan, and he continued those teachings. So the branch that comes through him is called the Ruhaniyat. And this book, this is their website. So I want to say the divine names, there's a book that is based on modern Western psychology about, if you have problems with your relation with your parents, or if you have a problem with your relationship with God, these things are related. And so you have to work with both, and you can use a certain divine name, reciting a divine name to work on that problem you might have with your mother, your father, or your spiritual life. Now, of course, Americans might not know how to pronounce a divine name, so you can go and listen to that name being pronounced so that you can learn. But by the way, you can choose. Do you want Arabic pronunciation, or do you want Indo-Pakistani pronunciation of that divine name? And you can choose the one you prefer to do your wazifa. But also, note it, you probably can't read it, it's small. It says, coming soon, there's going to be a board game. So people are going to be able to learn about the Asma al-Husna, sort of by drawing cards. And in fact, there already are cards. These are called wazifa cards. It's a deck of 99 cards, and each one has a divine name, and it briefly explains that name. So, the noun risk formed from its root means a gift of blessing from which all can benefit, etc., etc. So this is a way for people to learn and maybe even to do a kind of divination. You have your deck of the Asma al-Husna. What should you be concentrating today? You take one of the divine names and you can meditate on it. But you can go online and you can take courses. And these courses have been recorded. So you can meet in a group and you can participate in learning about the Asma al-Husna. Where did these ideas come from in the Ruhaniyat? From Inayat Khan, because Inayat Khan, that Indian Sufi, talked a lot about the descent of the soul from Lahut, Jabarut, Malakut into Nasut. So again, the soul comes down and then the soul returns. Of course, this is pure Ibn Arabi, beginning with Ibn Sina, it's Islamic cosmology. But you also have in the book Buddhist teachings, you have contemporary psychology, you have different zikrs. Now, Samuel Lewis, I mentioned this American, he was both a Zen master and a Sufi teacher. And he passed away, I think, in the very late 60s, like 1969. But he worked with an American teacher of dance. And they created something called Sufi dances, where people, don't think of like disco dance. Think more like people doing sort of like Helveti dervishes, or Mevlevis. Think of Mevlevi. You have a lot of people here dressed in the Mevlevi thing. So an idea of a choreographed celebration of the divine. But Samuel Lewis also taught walks. So somebody needs to be more Jalali. So they will do a kind of Jalali walk. They will walk with kind of a macho movement, and they might be reciting some wazifa, some divine name like Yahai, Yahai, which of course, if you go to Istanbul, that's what the Helveti dervishes do. But here you have a group of Americans who are, standing in a circle and saying that. So this is it. Now, this is the son of Inayat Khan, is the older figure on the left. That's Pir Vilayat Khan, who wrote about the divine names. And the current head of the order is Zia Inayat Khan. And sometimes he comes to Pakistan and he has disciples here. So I'll just say a little bit about Inayat Khan's teachings on the divine names. He calls them wazifa, of course, which is an Indian Sufi term for being assigned some zikr, some shugul, some practice. And he also calls them mantras, because Inayat Khan came from India. So there's a lot of crossover, chakras, latifas. So it's kind of new, we could say new agey, right? It's kind of a mix of Hindu and Islamic spirituality. So take, for example, the divine name Alim, Ya Alim. So Alim for Vilayat Khan is associated with this chakra here, whereas Fatah, the Ah, is associated with the heart. So you have a kind of mysticism of sound and a combination of Islam, Hinduism, and also kind of body, understanding that you are doing things with vibrations, right? Vilayat Khan also used the interpretation of Ibn Arabi, which he took from Henry Corbin, with whom he studied at the Sorbonne in the 1930s. There's a passage from Vilayat Khan that shows this kind of mixture of Hindu and Islamic thought. He says, sound is like waves of energy, like shabd or saut sanamadi, the mysticism of sound. Why do you recite these wazaif? Because the sound takes you beyond linear thinking. And you're American. Why are you reciting it in Arabic or Sanskrit? Because these languages make you more aware of the sound. You get the idea? How the divine names are being used. And also there's a lot, of material from classical Sufism. There's a scholar of Sufism, Carl Ernst, who writes about Sufism in India and Pakistan. And one of his chapters on modernity, he calls it, something like the unveiling of the secret. You know, for centuries, these Sufi practices were passed down from the murshid to the murid. But then you have printed books. So you can get some, like even Shah Waliullah, he wrote this book, Altaf al-Quds, about the Lataif. But then when you have print in the 1800s, you have a lithograph. So anybody can buy that book, right? And you don't need a murshid, you buy the book. So nowadays, the public, right? The public can know about these practices and ideas that used to be very limited. So Pir Vilayat, for example, he speaks about using a mental image when you're reciting Wahhab. You say, Wahrabu, Wahrabu, and you think of water flowing in your mind because that is the quality of the divine name. So you are using like meditation and so on to bring these divine names into manifestation. These are some courses in the lineage. So you can take a course in the divine names. The influences, I think I've already mentioned, are the Anayatiya order, Indian Sufism with a Kubrawi influence, creative imagination, Jungian psychology. I got the signal that I need to wrap up pretty quickly. I hope you got the idea that there's a lot of material. So there's another group in England that some scholars have called post-religious. There was a Turkish guy, Bülent Rauf, who died in 1987. He established something called the Bashara Center, which were universal Sufis. And there's actually a book about them if you get interested by Suhat Haji Faruqi. They use Ibn Arabi, but again, they're a bunch of British folks. So they basically had in those days like a Xerox of some pages from Afifi's writings on Ibn Arabi, and they used to get together and study it. But you can see their website is actually very sophisticated. They have a magazine, courses, and they founded something called the Ibn Arabi Society. Ibn Arabi Society, you can Google it, which is a combination of Western people who are using Ibn Arabi for personal transformation and scholars, you know, academic scholars who they patronize, and they have conferences. So Ibn Arabi is kind of not just an academic thing, but it is like a personal interest. So people in this order, for example, the Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi Society, they have translated Ibn Arabi's wird to recite. So it's sort of, you can have kind of Sufism without a murshid, right? You have the book and you're reading the wird of Ibn Arabi. Now, hybrid Sufi movements, these are the Islamic ones. And I just want to show you, these are some of the Sufi leaders who came and brought Islamic Sufism to the West. And many of them wrote on the divine names. This is Bawai Muhyiddin. This is the Helveti, the Turkish Helveti order under Muzaffar Ozak. This is the 99 names of Allah. This is another person from the same order, the named and the named. This is another hybrid teacher, Sheikh Jamal. And this is an online class. So all of these groups have online classes, and knowing the names of Allah is one of the main popular things. This is a book written by one of the followers, reciting the 99 names to the rhythms of the heart. You can go and register for an intensive zikr class. Wow, this one is upcoming November 2025. So you can get on board early if you want to join. So these Islamic Western movements, they do not talk so much about Buddhism and Hinduism. They talk about other Sufis along with Ibn Arabi. They are more devotional in using the divine names and less about Western psychology. And if they are magical, like one of the books, you know, she says, well, it's said that if you recite this divine name, it will repel enemies. Wallahu alam. You know, like she's a little uncomfortable with that. These are just some of the currents between Western Sufi uses of the divine names. Of course, the classical Islamic tradition, Sufism, Ibrahim al-Qurani in the Hijaz, the Indian Sufis who used Ibn Arabi, the Ottomans, Western scholars, 20th century psychology, and the modern self. And why are Westerners interested in the divine names? Some scholars say we have shifted. I think this is relevant to some of the discussions you've already heard in this conference. People looking for murshids. How do you be a good person today? So you are coming from a culture of I shouldn't stereotype, right? Traditionally, Pakistani Muslim culture could be termed a culture of duty. Duty to your parents, duty to the watan. You had those realms of relationships. What happens when a culture modernizes? It could become a culture of choice. Pick and mix. I'm going to do yoga, right? You have it right here. And I'm not saying it's bad, by the way. I'm just describing it, right? You might do yoga. Actually, I sat on the bus from Lahore, and the lady beside me, she said she does energy healing and Reiki. So it's already here in Pakistan, right? The culture of choice. The individual is the seeker. The person can decide how they're going to be religious. It is multi-religious, so you can have New Age, you can have Buddhist. People say, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual. And the divine names are spiritual. And academic studies also play a big role. And people want, as I earlier mentioned, they want to be healed. They want to grow. They want their spirituality and the religion to make them better. And that is the conclusion. Thank you so much for your attention.